As we kick off our discussion of macroeconomics, it's really important to understand why we're doing what we're doing. And it's also important to have the same language that people are using when they speak about macroeconomics. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kick off with the concept of unemployment, because that answers our question of why we're doing what we're doing. And it also helps us start to develop the language of macroeconomics, understanding what's important and what we're actually talking about. So when it comes to unemployment, most people think they know what unemployment is, but macroeconomists actually have very specific terms for what unemployment is and what we're talking about when we talk about labor force participation and what it means to actually be unemployed. So why is unemployment such a big issue within macroeconomics? Why is macroeconomics so important? Well, each 1 point increase in the unemployment rate is associated with increased domestic violence, 4,000 mental institute check-ins, 3.3 thousand more people sent to state prisons, 650 more homicides, 920 more suicides, and 37,000 more deaths. These are real life problems with just a 1 point increase in the unemployment rate. These numbers come from Greg Mankiw's textbook, and you can debate what the exact numbers are. There's different measures that try and go through these things, but these kind of costs definitely exist, right? To what extent is debatable, but the fact that they exist is something that people often don't think about. They think, oh, well, the economy's not going to do so well. It might struggle a little bit. There might be more unemployment, and that's not cool to have people not have jobs. But they don't think that people not having jobs is this serious, that it actually costs lives, that it actually costs really harmful outcomes for society. There's other studies out there that show indications of long run effects of people who, say, enter the workforce when there's high rates of unemployment, or for people who are unemployed for long periods of time. That can be really devastating for their long run career prospects. And so unemployment does these really big things that impact people's lives in this really negative way, right? So we don't usually think of, oh, okay, well, higher unemployment rate, that leads to more deaths, right? Or more suicides or more domestic violence. But the reality is that we have seen this can be the case. So why is macroeconomics so important? It's in part because of this. If we have macroeconomic instability, ups and downs of our macroeconomy, then what we're going to end up with is we're going to end up with situations where we get really high rates of unemployment, and we're going to get these consequences. We're going to get more people in prison, more people committing domestic violence, issues like this. And so if we can stabilize our macroeconomy, if we can try to avoid the ups and downs of the business cycle and try and keep stable our economy, we can prevent losses of life and loss of quality of life from lots of evidence out there supporting this idea that macroeconomic consequences are quite severe. So how do we speak about unemployment? How do we measure it? We're going to have four categories here that macroeconomists use to talk about unemployment and the issues around the labor market. So obviously we're going to have the idea that you could be employed or unemployed. But then also we have to talk about being in the labor force or not in the labor force. So let's define these four categories. Being employed is quite easy. It's kind of specifically defined as a person who's 16 years or older who is working for pay at least 1 hour per week. You can be self-employed or working 15 hours or more each week without pay in a family-operated enterprise and still be considered employed. Basically, long story short, if you have a job, you're employed. What about unemployed? Is that just you don't have a job? Because if you have a job, you're employed. That must mean if you don't have a job, you're unemployed. That's the way the average person thinks about this, but this is actually wrong. Not having a job does not mean you are unemployed. Unemployed means you are a person not currently employed who is either actively seeking a job or waiting to begin or return to a job. right? And so the way that macroeconomists use the term unemployed is not the same as the layman's idea of, oh, you're unemployed because you don't have a job. That's not true. You have to not have a job and be actively seeking or waiting to begin or return to a job. Now, to talk about being in the labor force or not in the labor force, we have to have this idea of what is the civilian labor force. And the idea is that people who are 16 years and older, who are either employed or unemployed, are in the labor force. So here we have a picture of me lecturing. I'm a professor and I get paid to lecture. I am in the labor force, right? So I am employed. So I would be in the labor force. If I did not have a job, but I was looking to become a professor, I would also be in the labor force. Being in the labor force just means you're employed or unemployed, right? It does not mean you're in the labor force. That means you're working. Nope. It means that you're trying to be working or you are working, right? In the labor force means employed or unemployed. Not in the labor force is all people who are 16 years or older who are neither employed nor unemployed. This can be people who are retirees, students, disabled people, right? Here I have a picture of my wife. My wife runs our household, basically. She's a stay-at-home mom. She is not in the labor force. She doesn't have a job and she's not actively seeking a job, right? This is kind of weird because we're not paying her to be a homemaker, a stay-at-home mom, things like that. However, she is doing a lot of things. She homeschools our kids, so she's a teacher. She does, yard work, so she could be considered, like a gardener and things like this. She makes meals. She could be a cook, right? She does all kinds of things around our house, and yet we don't pay her for it. So she is not employed. She is not a part of the labor force, right? She can lead a very fulfilling and busy life, but not be counted within our statistics of the labor force, right? So let's say that she cooks meals. If I were to pay somebody to cook meals for me, they would then be in the labor force. But since I don't pay my wife to cook my meals for me, right, she's not in the labor force. You're not in the labor force if you are not employed nor unemployed, right? So again, think retirees, students, stay-at-home mom and dad, or disabled people, things like that. That is not in the labor force. You don't have a job currently, nor are you looking for a job. An important calculation with the labor force is going to be the labor force participation rate. All that you do is you take the number of people who are in the labor force, those who are employed or unemployed, and you divide that by the overall population, right? And so you take the number of people in the labor force over the entire civilian population that is 16 years and older, and then what you get is you get the labor force participation rate. So another way of doing this would be that you could take the number of people employed plus the number of people unemployed, and then divide that by the overall civilian population. Our next statistic is the rate of unemployment. Here what you do is you take the number of people unemployed and you divide this by the number of people in the labor force. This is usually the number that people talk about when they're talking about macroeconomic issues. What is the unemployment rate? And here what we have to realize is that this is the number of people who do not have a job, who would like to have a job, the number of people unemployed, divided by just the labor force. So we're not counting the people who are not looking for a job, who are retired, things like that, right? And so this is the rate of unemployment, the unemployment rate here. You take the number of people unemployed and you divide that by the number of people in the labor force to see what's going on. To make sure you can understand these concepts, we have some data here to try and relate what is going on between unemployment and the labor force, to try and interpret the real world. And so these are some real numbers, kind of tracking men and women in the labor force participation from the around 1950 to around 2000. You can see for men, the labor force participation rate is slightly declining, right, during this time period. For women, it's increasing, and it's increasing quite a bit. And so we can look at what's happening here. Well, the idea is that more and more men that are of 16 years and older and part of the civilian population are going to be retired or are going to be, not participating in the labor force. They're going to be students, retirees, stay-at-home dads, things like that. So the numbers for the labor force participation is dropping slightly during this time period. Conversely, with women, more and more women were entering the labor force during this time period. So between 1950 and around 2000, we get this pretty big uptick in women being a part of the labor force. And so let's look at just these last couple of numbers here to kind of move on within this example. In 2003, we had 74% of men and 60% of women were in the labor force, right? We had this labor force participation rate of 74% and 60%. Where that is actually going on. And now let's look at these 2003 numbers, and we can break it up by age a little bit more. And on the left, we can see, okay, well, what ages were the men who were unemployed during this time period? What ages of the females were unemployed during this time period? But even more importantly, let's look to the middle. So you can see kind of this demographic breakdown where you can see, oh, well, what's happening in our country in terms of, people going to work or being unemployed and these kind of issues. And this is where you get into labor economics and you start talking about unemployment rates and labor force participation rates. And you can really start to try and understand what's happening to our macroeconomy. But let's look in the middle here, the middle section, at just what's happening in 2003 between men and women. As we looked at the last slide, we saw that the labor force participation rate of men in 2003 was 74%. The labor force participation rate of females during 2003 was 60%. So more men were in the labor force in 2003. But here we're looking at the unemployment rate. Men have a higher unemployment rate in 2003, 6.3%, than women do, 5.7%. So men had a higher unemployment rate in 2003. However, fewer women were employed at this time. Only 60% of women were in the labor force. And then of that 60% of the women who were in the labor force, 5.7% of that total were unemployed. Whereas with men, 74% were in the labor force. And here we see 6.3% of that group were unemployed. So a greater proportion of individuals in the labor force that were men, there was a greater proportion unemployed within men. But more men were actually in the labor force, right? And so if you can kind of understand that difference, that you could have more men in the labor force and yet simultaneously have more unemployed men, right? Then you are showcasing that you understand the difference between labor force participation and the unemployment rate. Understanding the labor force and what is happening to our workers is very important to thinking about the health of the overall macro economy. It really impacts everyday people's lives. Lives are literally at stake when we talk about unemployment. Unemployment, however, is a more complex topic than is usually recognized. And what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to talk about different types of unemployment as defined by macroeconomists. Click here to see more in this line of lecture series on unemployment as we move through an introduction to macroeconomics.